Well, it's brown and it's hot, and people drink it in the morning for energy.
Will coffee make you fat? Maybe not, but I'm pretty sure it helped make me fat and kinda anxious. So, is coffee bad for you, and how much should you drink? In May 2017, a 16-year-old Californian had a large Mountain Dew, a cafe latte, and chugged an energy drink within 40 minutes. He then collapsed and died from a caffeine-induced cardiac event. The total amount of caffeine he had was only 400 milligrams, the equivalent of 4 cups of coffee. On the other hand, a 2008 study on 817 Finnish adults found that the more coffee people drank, the longer they lived, with those drinking as much as 7 cups of coffee a day living the longest. The 16-year-old's case is an incredibly rare one, but clearly caffeine can have very different effects on different people. But why? It's hard to predict how each person will react to their own personalized cup of coffee because everyone metabolizes caffeine differently. And there's tons of other compounds in coffee that change depending on everything from how the coffee is grown and processed, to how the beans are roasted, to how you even prepare each cup of coffee. For example, it's been found that French press coffee raises cholesterol, whereas filtered coffee does not. Personally, I'm always more jittery with cheaper coffees, and I usually feel better with organic coffees. The difference is probably that non-organic coffees are doused with all kinds of pesticides. I'm also prone to feeling hot, nauseous, and jittery with black coffee, but feel fine with coffees with milk in it or lattes. About 2 months ago, I posted this poll on YouTube that got 15,000 votes from y'all. It's interesting to see that 21% of you said you felt way better after stopping drinking coffee, and 12% of you said you felt at least a little bit better. At the end of May, I proudly posted to my Patreon page this weaning strategy I used to get off of coffee. I ended up being coffee and caffeine free for a little over a month, and I was a lot better for it. The changes were subtle and came on slowly. I usually clench my jaw when I'm feeling tense, which is why my masseter muscle is so large. Sometimes I clench it so hard at night that I wake up with headaches and a lot of tension in the side of my face. Then I notice that when I'm not drinking coffee, I clench my jaw less, and I wake up with less tension in my face. I'm also less anxious throughout the day, and I have more stable focus without coffee. Most surprising to me, quitting coffee drastically reduced my appetite. When I was drinking 3 cups of coffee a day, it was like the only way to get full was to physically stretch my stomach with a huge mass of food. Once I cut out coffee, it was like my satiation hormones actually worked again, and I could eat like a regular human. But caffeine is a slippery slope. I ended up having a couple coffee dates with friends, and by July, I was once again drinking 3 double-shot lattes each morning. It took about 10 days to notice that I was getting a little bit hungrier, I was in general a little bit more anxious, and my focus throughout the day was less stable. The official stance is that we should keep our caffeine intake under 400 milligrams, 4 cups of coffee worth a day. But research has found that depending on who you are, it can take anywhere from 2.3 hours to 9.9 hours to metabolize half of your caffeine dose. Other research has found that if you're a slow metabolizer of caffeine, high caffeine consumption can increase your heart disease risk, but if you're a quick metabolizer of caffeine, then it can even lower your heart disease risk. In fact, you may even enjoy the flavor of coffee more or less depending on how quickly you can metabolize caffeine. This study found that people who metabolize caffeine more slowly actually perceive it as more bitter. Now, you might think, nice, well, if I'm a fast metabolizer of caffeine, I'll get the benefits from coffee rather than the detriments.
A damn fine cup of coffee.
However, my DNA report shows that I actually metabolize caffeine faster than average, yet I seem to still have these issues with coffee.
Hot coffee! You idiot!
So first, let's take a look at caffeine and hunger. Caffeine activates the stress axis and raises the stress hormone cortisol, and cortisol has been found to increase appetite. And while another study didn't find that caffeine directly increases appetite, it did find that caffeine makes it harder for cortisol levels to fall. In fact, Stephen Chernisky, author of the book Caffeine Blues, writes that people who consume more than 300 milligrams of caffeine per day may have elevated serum cholesterol for 18 hours a day. Also, caffeine may make it to where we perceive and physiologically react to stressful things as if they're even more stressful.
The fact is that you and I are sitting here today because this will be your last week of employment at this company.
A 1974 study found that in a group of people told that they were going to be fired from their job, stress-related noradrenaline output was greater in those who regularly drank caffeine. Essentially, their physiological response to stress was greater thanks to the caffeine. These caffeine drinkers were probably feeling specifically more anxious about losing their job, considering noradrenaline provokes anxiety. Is this enough to say that caffeine was making me fat and hungry? Well, I suppose not. But higher stress levels have been linked to higher abdominal fat, and there's evidence that people with more body fat secrete more of the stress hormone cortisol. And again, cortisol raises appetite, making for a vicious cycle. And it has been found that increased anxiety increases people's appetite, and the food actually relieves the anxiety. So, let's take a look at coffee and caffeine's relationship to anxiety, because maybe my increased appetite is simply downstream of the increased anxiety I get from drinking coffee. Research has been done showing coffee consumption has people with bruxism clench their jaw more. As I explained earlier, this is the case for me too. I happen to clench my jaw when I'm anxious or tense, and it seems that I'm generally more anxious throughout the day when I'm regularly drinking coffee. There's multiple papers talking about the anxiety-inducing effects of caffeine, and there have been cases in the past of normal, healthy people suffering from panic attacks from just 500 milligrams of caffeine, about 5 cups of coffee. A paper looking at people with panic disorder found that 71% of the patients said that drinking caffeine felt similar to the experience of having a panic attack, but to a lesser degree, of course. Several papers describe a phenomenon called Caffeinism, which is essentially chronic anxiety from drinking too much caffeine. As early as 1978, it was written that there is no reliable way to tell the difference between someone who actually has an anxiety disorder and someone who is simply sensitive to caffeine and is drinking too much of it. In fact, in a study looking at 6 different cases of people with an anxiety disorder to the degree that they were taking medication for their anxiety, all 6 of them had massive improvements in their anxiety after quitting caffeine, and 5 of the 6 no longer needed any anxiety medication after stopping the caffeine. Actually, one of the people, after going caffeine-free and getting rid of his anxiety, accidentally had caffeinated coffee one day and then experienced anxiety symptoms for the next 2 weeks. Many papers find that more caffeine leads to more anxiety in normal people, and of course, people with anxiety disorders are much more sensitive to caffeine. So, what if caffeine is inducing at least some small, subtle amount of anxiety in everyone, and you just notice it more or less depending on how sensitive you are to caffeine? How easy is it to tell if you're just having a bad day or if you've had a little bit too much coffee? Here's the thing about caffeine. Clearly, it's changing something in the brain. If the caffeine just made you feel good and focused for a little while and then completely disappeared from your system after a couple hours, then we wouldn't have withdrawal effects if we missed our morning cup of coffee, but we do. Caffeine works by blocking the action of the chemical adenosine in our brains. When adenosine normally acts on an adenosine receptor, we feel sleepy, and part of the reason caffeine has its effects is because caffeine blocks this sleepy adenosine receptor. I think most people have heard about the cool neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, but people don't talk about adenosine very often. Adenosine receptors are in almost all organs and tissues, and they're found throughout the brain and spinal cord. Adenosine has a lot of complicated functions. Research has found adenosine to have anti-inflammatory properties. Adenosine regulates sleep, and it lessens the excitability of brain cells, meaning it calms you down. And it also has effects on blood vessels. In fact, research has found that when you give people caffeine, blood flow in the brain is reduced. Research has also found that adenosine has anti-anxiety and antidepressant effects. You don't have to remember all that, but my point for now is just that the adenosine system is very intricate and nuanced. We can't just say, oh, well, adenosine is the sleepy chemical, and I don't want to be sleepy, so I'll drink plenty of caffeine and all my problems will be solved with no side effects. When you constantly block adenosine receptors in the brain creates more receptors to make balance in response to the fact that the receptors are receiving abnormally low stimulation. To get more specific for a moment, there are several types of adenosine receptors, but the main ones are A1 and A2A. And caffeine works by blocking both of these. Constantly blocking adenosine receptors means more adenosine receptors will be created. So what happens when you have more adenosine receptors, making your brain more sensitive to adenosine? Well, consider this. Anxiety and depression often appear together. And research has found that if you expose rodents to chronic stress, this chronic stress creates more adenosine A2A receptors in the rodent's brain. And this increase in A2A receptors is accompanied by an increase in depression-like behavior. Another way you can increase A2A adenosine receptors is by drinking caffeine. The brain changes you see in the brain when you constantly drink caffeine are similar to the brain changes you see when constantly exposed to stress. So sure, caffeine may actually have an antidepressive effect temporarily because it blocks these A2A receptors. As you know, caffeine improves your mood, but this research suggests that the brain is changed in a way that when the caffeine starts to wear off, your overall baseline mood is worse compared to when you didn't have a caffeine habit. Another thing is that activating A1 receptors has antidepressant effects. In fact, oddly enough, sleep deprivation seems to have an antidepressant-like effect on people. The longer you stay awake, the more adenosine builds up, and this adenosine acts on A1 receptors and gives an antidepressant effect. But remember, caffeine blocks these A1 receptors. This kind of made sense to me. When I was drinking coffee, I did notice that my mood was just a little bit more variable. I would feel especially positive and confident right after I had my coffee, but as the caffeine started to wear off, I noticed I was a little more unsure of myself and was a little bit more pessimistic about things. Other than adenosine receptors, caffeine also causes physical changes to several other brain receptors very important to mood, like adrenaline receptors, GABA receptors, and serotonin receptors. Adrenaline is part of the stressful fight or flight response. Serotonin is an important neurotransmitter for positive mood, and GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, meaning it helps you relax. A lot of research has been done on the importance of GABA in anxiety disorders. In fact, as this 2012 review explains, a deficit of GABA signaling in the brain is a commonality between anxiety disorders and major depression. And caffeine disrupts the normal metabolism of GABA. Research has found that putting caffeine in mice's drinking water decreases the amount of GABA in the mice's brains. So, does all this prove that the anxiety you experience in your life is mostly due to caffeine? Well, no, but at least for me specifically, I don't need to read all these research papers to understand that caffeine enhances, at least a little bit, my baseline level of anxiousness. At the start of the video, I explained that there are many individual differences between people in how they process caffeine. My point with this is to say that if you enjoy caffeine and you don't consider yourself an anxious person, and you are totally content with how you feel, then you probably don't have to go out of your way to change your morning routine. Some of you might be wondering why tea makes you feel better than coffee. It might be because of a compound called L-theanine, which is found in tea and not coffee. This study found that taking 250 milligrams of L-theanine with 150 milligrams of caffeine led to people having better reaction times, they had less headaches, felt less fatigued, and felt more alert than just taking caffeine alone. In fact, L-theanine is a popular supplement specifically for that reason. It's taken to reduce coffee jitters. One last thing, maybe you want to try quitting coffee, but you want to live forever like those 7-cup-a-day Finnish people. But was coffee really making them live longer? Or is it simply that people with super robust bodies and livers who can happily process cup after cup of coffee without any ill effects are just naturally more robust and therefore live longer? After all, the reason people with liver disease, for example, don't drink so much caffeine is probably because their weakened livers have a really hard time processing it. So it's probably not the case that drinking a bunch of coffee makes people live longer, but that the people that can drink a bunch of coffee live longer. So if you're looking for some advice, try drinking a couple different quality coffees until you find the one that makes you feel the best. And then if you're not totally satisfied with how you feel, you could pair it with L-theanine. If you're not having any luck with that, then you could at least try seeing how you feel without coffee for a couple weeks. Since blocking adenosine receptors has tons of downstream effects, you might notice some changes that don't seem like they would be caused by coffee. But make sure you pay attention. Honestly, it took me 2 cycles of quitting coffee for a month, and then having less appetite, and then starting coffee again, and then having more appetite, to finally confirm for myself that yes, I was gaining weight from my coffee habit. The changes you feel will probably come on very slow, and you also have to pay attention to distinguish them from the withdrawal effects. If you like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and sign up for my newsletter in the description. I did tons of research on caffeine for this video, so I may make a newsletter about that soon. You can also catch me on Twitter and Instagram. So you're playing pool with your friend, and he's looking at this setup. He's about to send the cue ball straight into the 8-ball. After your friend makes the shot, which of the balls will move? If you'd like to know the answer and learn more about the rules that govern the world around you with fun challenges like this, you'll have to check out Brilliant's Scientific Thinking course. If you're naturally curious or want to build your problem-solving or analytical abilities, you'll enjoy Brilliant's thought-provoking math, science, and computer science content designed to break complex scientific concepts down into understandable chunks. Like this lesson on neural networks. It takes you from how a computer learns to play tic-tac-toe up to how artificial neurons are trained. With over 60 interactive courses in math, science, and computer science, Brilliant will grow your understanding of our modern world with a structured and engaging approach. Check out brilliant.org/WIL, and the first 200 people to follow my link will get 20% off the annual subscription.